Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special event, a reading of High as the Waters Rise. We're honored to have here both the novel's author, Anja Kampmann, and her English translator, Ann Posten. For those Berry College students here, for cultural events credit, we will post a link during the Q&A following the reading, which will take you to a short survey that you can complete in the next 24 hours. It's my honor now to introduce to you Anja Kampmann and Ann Posten. German poet Anja Kampmann was born in Hamburg and resides in Leipzig. High as the Waters Rise, a current finalist for the US's National Book Award in Translated Literature, is her debut novel. The book has been awarded the Mara Cassens Prize for the Best German Debut Novel, as well as the Lessing Promotion Prize and the Bergen and Keim Prize. Ann Posten translates poetry, prose, and drama from the German into English. She is the recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship, and her translations of authors such as Peter Bixel, Carl Selig, Thomas Brosch, Tancred Darst, Anna Katharina Hahn, and Peter Scherbart have appeared with New Directions, the University of Chicago Press, Music and Literature, N+1, Vice, the Buenos Aires Review, Field, Stonecutter, and Hanging Loose, among other publications. She is based in Berlin. High as the Waters Rise follows Václav, who one night aboard an oil drilling platform in the Atlantic returns to his cabin to find that his bunkmate and intimate companion, Matthias, has gone missing. A search of the rig confirms his fear that Matthias has fallen into the sea. Grief-stricken, he embarks on an epic, emotional, and physical journey that takes him to Morocco, to Budapest, and Matthias's hometown in Hungary, to Malta, Italy, and finally to the mining town of his childhood in Germany. Václav's encounters along the way with other lost and yearning souls, Matthias's angry, grieving half-sister, lonely rig workers on shore leave, a truck driver who watches the world change from his driver's seat, bring us closer to his origins, while also revealing the problem of a globalized economy dependent on waning natural resources. High as the Waters Rise is a gorgeous and painful meditation on the nature of memory and grief and the cost of freedom, revealed through the story of a man who stands at the margins of a society from which he has profited little, though its functioning depends on his labor. What is perhaps most remarkable about this book is its accomplished poetic lyricism, which serves not as embellishment, but rather the very means by which we are brought so deeply into the novel's focal character that we not only understand, but we experience with him the bewilderment brought about by love's loss. This remarkable lyricism serves not as decoration, but rather as revelation. In Václav's persistent grief, times and places blend and swirl as he is engulfed by memories as all-encompassing as the rough sea that surrounded him those many years he spent on oil rigs. If, for Václav, time was like a tunnel which was now gradually growing dark, it is also, as Kampmann writes, as translated by Posten, as if a person were just a membrane that everything could pass through. Everything could only wash over him now. Motifs and images of flight and cage also resonate through the novel. There's a literal canary in the mine, which Václav's father worked, as Václav remembers how the miners would bring birds in cages into the shaft, how when a bird stopped singing, the miners must race against time in a desperate attempt to escape the deadly gas coming next for them. There are the homing pigeons, an older friend Václav is reunited with, keeps, and tenderly cares for, and particularly Innie, the pigeon that Václav releases at his friend's urging in their shared hometown of the past, which Václav drives to, days away, the bird whose challenge is to fly back to her distant home from this strange new place, a test of the magnetic sense which was supposed to be even in the beak, the seat of language, the homing instinct. But for Václav, his return to his hometown is not a return home, but simply another part of his wandering in his ungrounding grief. It is as if he were searching for something other than the eternal waiting, Kampmann writes, but he can find no reason for all that had come to pass. For Václav, in reviewing his life, it seems absence always had to be the larger portion, though for a few moments, everything was so damn real. Please welcome Anja Kampmann and Ann Posten.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Sandra.
So I think we'll begin by reading from near to the beginning of the book. The book begins on the oil rig on which Václav worked. And this section that we'll read from, Anja will read a little bit in German and then I'll continue in English. This section is directly after his dear companion, friend, bunkmate, I think companion is one of the best words, has disappeared inexplicably.
Yeah. So I will read briefly in German so that you get a sense of the original or the the German version. Musste etwas geträumt haben. Beim Schrillen des Alarms erinnerte nicht mehr als Fetzen, Bäume in einer Landschaft, ein paar Hügel. Es war der Wecker von Matthias, dem noch ein paar Minuten zum Beginn seiner Schicht blieben. Das Licht war noch eingeschaltet, die Luft stickig und feucht. Er hatte vergessen, die Tür zum Bad zu schließen. Matthias war nicht da. Wind drückte gegen die Kabinenwand, auf dem Gang war es ruhig. Sie würden die Arbeit noch ein paar Stunden aussetzen lassen. Er drehte sich auf die Seite und starrte die Sachen an. Alles lag unverändert, auch sein Bündel mit dem Speckstein lag, wo es immer lag. Václav zog die Decke enger um sich und meinte, die Augen nur kurz geschlossen zu haben, als etwas ihn hochschrecken ließ. Dumpf, sehr fern, nicht das Poltern der Schritte auf dem Gang, etwas anderes als das durchdringende Signal, das die Arbeit fortsetzen sollte.
He must have dreamed, but when the alarm shrilled, he remembered only shreds, trees and a landscape, some hills. It was Matthias' alarm, only a few minutes left before his shift. The light was still on, the air stuffy and damp. He'd forgotten to close the bathroom door. Matthias wasn't there. Wind pressed against the cabin wall. It was quiet in the hallway. They'd keep work suspended for a few more hours. He turned on his side and stared at their things. All was unchanged, even his pack with the soapstone that he always carried. It lay where it always lay. Václav pulled the blanket tighter and thought he had just closed his eyes when something startled him awake, dull and distant. Not the clatter of steps on the walkway, something other than the piercing signal for work to continue. The unease was unexpected and strong. It seemed to emanate from the bright wall, where the sudden daylight traced a clear line. Matthias' warm fleece still hung in the closet. So he brought him the sweater. The morning was clear, heavy clouds moved across the early blue as if in a hurry. In the distance, a silvery shimmer still lingered. He carried the fleece from Matthias and he carried it like a plea, while the running of the machines suddenly struck him as unreal. Here we are, Petrov said, as he came around the light blue tank behind which they extracted the drill cuttings. He saw the familiar pans with the sludge, the stones and muddy earth, saw all the things that were familiar to him, the shaker screens, the monitors and hoses, saw Petrov with his good-natured smile, but he did not see Matyas. Where's your friend this morning? Petrov took off his safety goggles and looked at Václav in the same way Václav was looking at him. Petrov had wanted to wait until Matyas came by himself. Work had gotten off to a slow start after that night. Václav didn't have to remind him of the darkness of the sea. They looked. It only occurred to him later, after they had searched every room, the whole deck, every corner and step, all the way down to the boat landings, the gym, the mess hall several times, and several times their own cabins, after announcements were made, after the drilling foreman subjected the workers to a standardized round of questioning, the sky broke into a radiant noon, while nothing of the day and none of the seabirds that flew over the water could possibly be real. Radio messages went out, someone brought him a hot drink, and he scanned every jacket leg with his eyes, the water's surface with its crazy shimmer. After they tried to drag him in and finally left him to sit between the tanks and an even, round sun sank into the water, only then did he notice that his fist was closed around something, which only then, in the evening and before the flat horizon, turned into something that had once been Matyas' fleece. On this evening, the moon seemed scarce, hovering as it did above the swaying sea. In his bed, Václav still wore his boots. A few feathers escaped from the pillow. Some huge being had ripped everything away, everything that had been only yesterday. He stood in the cabin and regretted winding up Matyas' headphones. He thought about it, about the fact that he picked them up, that he couldn't hold any of it off, that it was now evening, and the storm was over and it had grown dark as it always did. He heard steps outside. The men ambled into the mess hall in their sweaty t-shirts. They were hungry. The food smelled. He couldn't stay in the cabin. He went out. The sea was almost calm. Now and then they sent someone to come and check on him. At some point, Petrov came and offered him cigarettes, and Václav watched as he sat next to him, wordlessly smoking. They could cost you your job, Václav said, and Petrov laughed softly, took one more drag, and looked straight out at the sea. They'll be asking you too, he said. They're not going to send anyone out to look for him, are they? No, Petrov said, they most certainly won't. They were silent a while. Gas was still being flared. A seagull flew past through the floodlight. Sometimes they came over from the tankers. What will you do now? Petrov asked. Where will you go? They looked down at the water as it grew dim and a light sheen rode the swells. Back, Václav said. Where is that? He thought he saw a smile in Petrov's eyes. What about you? Václav asked finally. Wife and kid, Petrov said. Fucking hell. They think it's good money out here. That's what they all think. The last light came from far away and fell on the gray stubble of his chin. Drops fell, echoing behind them on the empty tank. The wind picked up, rubbing against the bars and cables. Petrov put up his hood. I can't let you stay out here, Wenzel. Come on in. He put his arm around Václav. It was an arm that knew that the next days, too, would taste of rain and clouds, and of their passing. He couldn't stand to be in the cabin. He said Dobranoc to Petrov and went to the mess hall. Fat Lukács stood behind the counter, and he wrung his chef's hat between his hands when he saw Václav, as if he saw a shadow beside him. And he heard how they lowered their voices, Mikhail and Ray and Steve. Someone pushed back a chair. Wenzel, do you want to join us? Thanks, but I won't stay. But then he sat anyway, a long line, with an instant lemon tea lukewarm in its paper cup. Enough silence to make their forearms stick to the tabletop. Have you guys seen these t-shirts? Bright red and green. Ray was wearing a washed out sweatshirt with a manga print, a princess and a sword. A few feet separated his table from theirs. He noticed how they looked at him, how their eyes wandered surreptitiously over, as if it were his fault that no one was getting out the cards and they couldn't yell across the room to Lukács, who absently wiped at the glass as if he'd only just noticed the film of grease on the divider before the shimmering meatballs. Václav wasn't sure it was the same room. He told Lukács to fry him up a couple of eggs and ate them with some cold potatoes. Suddenly he was hungry. He was careful not to scratch the plate with his fork. It was no longer their mess hall, but it was the same room. At some point, a new decade had begun, and they'd sat here and played with all the strength of extinguished firecrackers. Matyas, young enough, lively. Never before had Václav spent a night at these tables. Never had he loved the sudden distance that surrounded them more.
Thank you, Anne.
Yeah. Shall we? Go ahead.
So I guess we should, before we jump into the next passage, maybe we should talk a bit about the story and how it evolves. And from this point now, Václav has to leave the rig. He's got some rather ugly conversations with his rig manager, and goes back to their room in Tangier or Tanga, northern Morocco, where they shared a room. They've got two big cupboards there, and but the room is empty. And but I think, Václav realizes that nobody's gonna take care of Matyas or the whole story. So there, after some days he spends there, he decides to go to Matyas' hometown. In the first chapter, we learn that Matyas is originally from Hungary, from a small village, and before when he arrives in Budapest, there's one scene in a tailor, where he sits with the tailor, and he's waiting for this tailor to make a suit for him. And I was wondering, there's one passage in the beginning of the 6th chapter, and I was wondering if you could read it a little bit, because I guess rather than giving the journey that we are on is also a journey of language, I guess, and I think this tailor passage also tells a little bit about the tailoring of the book and the language.
Well, I'll read just this one paragraph and then we'll talk about it. The thin man had hardly moved from his stool for the past 5 days, and he barely spoke unless spoken to. He'd seen Yanni coughing secretly into a napkin, seen how his fingers occasionally trembled. He wasn't in a hurry, Václav had said. He had long since lost track of what the individual pieces meant. And as he watched the tailor join the padding, the horsehair canvas interfacing, the pockets and all the seams, watched him bring the blind stitching and layers from right to left into their proper form, where all of this would remain hidden inside the jacket. He wondered whether one day a moment would come when someone would flip over a life and all the individual layers would finally form a whole. Whether Milena would be one piece and Matyas, and whether someone who was missing would still be a part of it, like padding that remains in place forever. Do you want to say something about the passage, or shall I start?
You can start. I will ask you something later, but yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure this is one of the, at first I thought, what do I have to say about this with this little paragraph? But actually I think it's a perfect paragraph to talk about the book and to talk about so many things that I had to navigate or think about or enjoy while translating the book. And I think one of the reasons that that's the case is that this image, as Anja, I think you'll probably say, is an image of the creation of the book and is an image of how Václav's story is told and also maybe how he thinks. But it's such an unusual metaphor that at first it didn't, I think at first it didn't strike me as important and central to the book as it ultimately proves to be. And it's also in some ways it seems like it should be such a banal paragraph, should be easy to translate. I was so consumed by all the research on rigs and pigeons and all this kind of thing. There was a ton of research actually into tailoring, and this is a minor episode in the book, but just to get things like blind stitching, we had to talk about that and figure out exactly what was happening, because it's just tailoring isn't the kind of thing that I think about all the time. But I think another thing that's nice about this is that it's so much of the book is told through images like this. And this is a moment where Václav himself reflects on what the image means. This is a moment where Václav says, is this what life is like? Is this what grief is like? Is it like tailoring a suit? Is it like padding? And that's sort of a key for me, because he doesn't always do that. A lot of times there are images, and once you get to know moments like this, and once you get to know Václav, you can start to imagine why the image is there. But this is a sort of moment where he really speaks, and he interprets something poetically himself, and I think that helps me a lot in getting to know him, actually.
Yeah, I was thinking that for me it reflects a little bit about the writing of the novel, and I think the journey that the novel takes us on is also a journey in language, and in that it connects places and times that are meaningful to Václav. So instead of I think it's a book which is a bit difficult to summarize. It's also a bit how it felt to sort of write the novel, because it's got so many places and time layers, and I was also wondering what it was like to translate this sort of layered story, because I think there are so many layers, and maybe we could talk a little bit, because I think the story evolves in that Václav goes on his journey and meets a lot of people, but then there's also this other sort of direction with memories from home, or the time before, or the time with Matthias. Maybe you could say a little bit how it was for you to get through.
I mean, I think I just translated it from beginning to end. So in some ways it was just like reading it very, very slowly. But I think that's very apt what you say. I think when I first read the book, I thought, and I've said this before, but it felt so much like a novel. Like it's clearly a novel, it's clearly a story. As you were saying before, people telling stories, something that you found in Iowa, it's absolutely a story. But then once you spend more time with it, the question becomes, what is it actually a story of? Because the obvious layer is, it's the story of Václav's journey. Václav's friend dies and he goes on a journey, classic sort of story setup. He goes on a journey and he grieves and he meets people and he learns things. But the second layer that is made up of a lot of different things, but I think is the story of who Václav actually is. How did this person come to be? What are all of the things in the last 12 years, at least, maybe more, actually maybe since his childhood, that have made him react to the world the way he does and take this journey in the first place? And it's a very personal encounter with him, but it's also it feels like he's a person very clearly influenced by what has happened to him and by the structures of the world around him, by the fact that he grew up in this mining town in the Ruhr, and that's translating that's so many worlds away from me. So there's so much I need to learn about that world to find out why it made him the way he is, and why growing up there, pigeons meant so much to him. That's so far from my experience. Why one would have nostalgia for pigeons is just not the life I've lived. And then why he goes to work on a rig, and what that means to him, and what it's like, because it's not just working on the rig, it's also being in all these strange different places that seem so exotic, seem so far from his experience, and how he encounters them, how whether they're homes to him or not, and whether they're in some way all the same, all this one other place.
Yeah. And also I think the question really is how does it come together if you lose someone who's very close and you don't really have someone to share your stories with, who's going to tell your story, who's going to make like one picture out of it. I'm looking at my watch. Maybe we should get into the last scene. Would you say something about it beforehand, or should I?
So this is a little bit farther on. Matthias has now already been, I'm sorry, why do I keep saying Matthias? Václav has already now been to Matthias's hometown and met his sister. And he's now, he thinks, on his way back to work. That's not the way it ends up, but he's in a town waiting to go back to work on the rig, and he has this meeting, which we'll read from, with an experienced rig hand, someone that he knows from previous times in his work. Maybe we should just read in that same word. You'll read a little bit and then I'll take over.
Yeah. So we're at the coast of Morocco again. That's maybe also important. An area where they keep searching for oil. And I will read a small passage in English and then Anne will continue. Sorry. Okay. That night he took a taxi to the edge of the city. Sidi Ifni was small and it wasn't a long drive. The bar was squat and stood at the edge of a cliff. Inside there was a heavy wooden door behind which the drinks were poured. He found Troy out behind the bar on a low bench, his sharp knees pointing toward the sea far beneath the cliff. Here one could hear the waves smacking against the sand in the darkness, the gurgling under the cliffs that stood on the sides of the bay, like large animals, like something that waited. Sit down, Troy said. He smoked as he had learned to long ago in the army. He hid the glow in his palm. He lifted his chin as if thinking about something, and even in the semi-darkness, Václav could see that the skin underneath had grown slack. Troy's English was a friendly sing-song. Václav gave him a beer. Thank you, mate. He asked Troy what was new out there. He said, not much. They've expanded the area. To hell, he said, it's steep, like this. Troy tilted his bottle just slightly to the side. If you ask me, he said, and waved the thought away with his hand. They see it as a matter of area now, but the oil doesn't come from that alone. And then you poor devils have to go out there again. It will be a while, Václav said, but it will happen. They were silent. The night was clear. The door swung open and closed a few times. People walked over the gravel to the parking lot. Music played in a car. I heard about your friend, Watts, Troy said. Yes. He held the bottle as if he couldn't move. Yes, Troy said. They looked out. A distant freighter thrust itself slowly out into the night.
You know what I've never understood, even after all these years, Troy finally said. You shoot the cannon, and the sound goes down, and the reverberation hits the ocean floor. And all you do is wait for an answer. But there's something between the shot and the first signal. I don't mean just the time. No matter how short the interval is, there will always be a gap. You know, my whole life just revolves around that space. It's strange that you guys are looking out there, Václav said. They're looking everywhere. Troy shook his head. I could be somewhere else. Václav stood up and went to the bar. He bought 4 more bottles, and they were ice cold, and he carried them out. They didn't clink them, but they drank. I was one of the first on Brent, Troy said. It was a night like this one. I was young and couldn't sleep. I went up onto the helideck. The moon was almost full. It was spring, still cold. Maybe something had woken me. The sea was blue and silver and ice cold, northeast of Shetland. He paused as if he needed a breath. And then I saw it. Their backs first, a whole family. There were a lot of them, as if they were bathing in that strip of moonlight, watching to see what we were up to. I never saw so many again. Not a single one in the last few years. I guess they understood what we were up to. But when you see them, you believe that they were there much earlier, that we'll never have anything on them. And the oil fields, too, as if they'd been there for all eternity. But they die quicker than flies. They sat. Chairs were put up in the bar. They could hear it. Where to? Troy said finally. We're at the same hotel, no? No, I mean, where to, Vats? What are you going to do? He felt the bench against his back. The air was warm, but he was freezing. North. You quit? Don't tell them I'm here. I won't. No. Troy put his bottle down. The glass crunched softly against the sand. Do you know that we learned it from them? The seismics, to use the reverberation? They took different ways home, each through his own night. Do you have anything to say about that, or should we open it up to questions from the audience?
I think we should open it up. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that was beautiful. Thank you so much, both of you. So yes, you should be able to type your questions into chat. So please let us know. We will read them. While we're waiting for those to come up, can I ask you, how long did this whole project of the translation take you, Anne?
I'm so glad you asked. I wrote an essay about the translation, and I talked about the fact that people often ask that question, how long did it take? And that it's, for this book especially, a really apt question in that this book is so much about work. And of course, I translated it also as work, but it's such a different kind of work, and it's so difficult to quantify. And I can actually, I have somewhere a number of hours that I spent on the book. And when you boil it down to the hours, it's a laughably small number. I mean, how many 12-hour shifts did I spend on this book? Very few. And at the same time, I've been working on it for a long time. I started translating a little bit of it just a few months after it came out. And then I used that sample to try to find a publisher. That took a while. The publisher said yes now 2 years ago. Is that right, Anja? I think that's right. 2 years ago.
Yeah,
November, 2 years ago. So I guess in a way, I started working on it really full-time beginning of 2019, and then finished it sometime near the end of 2019.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we're getting some questions now. So one person asked, what was the inspiration for the story? It is such an elaborate, rich story.
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. I really came up with Václav, the character, first. I first came across him in a short story I wrote, and ever since I started to do research on oil rigs and on this whole political sphere that goes with with oil exploitation and the whole. I really didn't want to go into this like an author telling about the bad things in the world. I really wanted to write a story and I also realized that I had a lot of questions, and so I think the story sort of evolved in two directions. The one was that I really wanted to find out who he was and who he had been before he started working on the rigs, and then how it somehow this friendship and love to Matthias changed him, and then to see how he deals with it. It really, Václav was really the main character, and in the beginning, I think the most difficult part was to find a voice for him, because you could never have this story with an I telling his story or Václav telling his story, because he just wouldn't talk and he wouldn't reflect upon these things. He really is a character who does not want to reflect upon the last years and what kind of decisions he made or did not make. So that was I think the most difficult part in the beginning, to really find a voice and find a tone which would allow me, on the one hand, to show this sort of rough world, and on the other hand, sort of allow a more like poetical technique of waving layers together, so to say. Yeah.
Great. Someone else asks, she says, much of the author's writing, both in this novel and in many of her poems, are about various cities and locations. Has she had the opportunity to see these places for herself, or is she writing about them from what she has learned about them?
Oh, I did a lot of research and travels. That's really something I love about writing, that it sort of opens up new worlds also for me. And I also, I think if I have the opportunity to go, I would certainly go and talk to people. And it really changes also your perception. My preconceived idea of Tangier or Tanger, for example, was very different to the city I found when I was there. And I think for sometimes I don't even have long passages that would describe everything, but for me it's very important to have a sort of short atmospheric description which would sort of bring you to the place. And therefore I think it's important to be there. And then for the poems, I don't know which poems you refer to, but Minsk or Maribor, they are places I visited, and I didn't even go there in the first place to write about them, but then I somehow they somehow left an image, and I wanted to deal with it. And also there's a lot of history I'd like to deal with in poetry. Yeah.
This next question is for Anne. Is the process for translating similes, metaphors, and more abstract concepts different than literal translation? How much liberty can be taken by the translator in this situation?
Wow. That's a great question and a hard question. I'm afraid my answers to how I translated this book may be unsatisfying, in that it felt often very intuitive. and I can say things that weren't intuitive, or I can answer that question a little bit more directly maybe. But this book to me feels so much like a clear whole, so much like a nothing out of place really. No real breaks in the voice, that the process of translating it, at least on good days, was writing it over again, trying to make it feel to me like it had felt in the original. And whether that meant taking liberties, it's hard to say. Probably at some point. I don't know, when Anja was just reading the first part in German, I was following along. I haven't done that. I haven't followed along in English while she reads in German before, but it was really nice. It felt to me, at least in that moment, that I was reading at the same pace she was. And that's really good. That seems like somehow I got the same rhythm. But I'm sure in other moments that's not the case. I'm sure in other moments, and especially because the question is about figurative language, I guess. It was certainly important to me, especially with images, to make sure that the image worked in this. The image came across as an image in English without being an explanation of the image, which was sometimes challenging because some of the images are surprising, and some of the images I didn't see myself, and I had to ask Anja about, and then make sure that the reader saw them then the way I saw them through Anja. I hope that answers the question.
Great. The next question is for Anja. The person says, I read in a recent interview with you that your book also deals with climate change, the exploitation of our planet, and so on. Yet your protagonist in this novel does not care about this topic. How do you write against your own, the author's concerns, i.e. climate change, when creating such a fictional character? Do you like him as a protagonist?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think he doesn't really have much of a choice. It would feel fake to me to have a character like this who really has these 12-hour shifts and a really tough life, and then make him have like monologues on climate, which which is something that also in my conversations with rig workers wasn't really a big topic. I also talked to people who did fracking in Romania, which is horrible, but they would tell me about their days and how they were structured and what kind of machinery they would use, and what they what they were doing during the holidays. So for them, I think it is a different reality, which doesn't. I might not talk for everybody out there, but it might be a privilege also to sit back and reflect upon the whole thing and say like, oh, I would never do this in my life, because we don't need to. For me, it was also interesting because it is a topic which is very important to me, and also with the whales in the scene Anne just read out, I would just have them and have a scene which sort of shows their beauty, and have someone saying, well, I don't see them anymore, but I think they are much smarter than we are. And that would sort of be a way or my way to sort of have these beautiful worlds which we destroy. But I think that's that from my perspective, it works better than having a narrator who goes like, oh, well, I'm going to tell you now what happened to the whales out there. That's one thing one can do, but this is really a decision I made for the novel and how I wanted to structure the novel. And And I think it's also very healthy not to have, or healthy is maybe the wrong word, but it gives you a lot of freedom to have characters who just live a different life and have different topics they deal with. And if I like Václav, I think I do like him. I think he's not 100% nice guy, and I think he's also harsh, and he's been harsh with himself or to himself, and he's made a lot of decisions I wouldn't have made. But I think that's not the question. I think the question is, do we get to know him, and do we understand what he's like? And I think there are a lot of reasons why he doesn't think about climate change, and why he doesn't really have a choice to do whatever, farming or what. I don't know. So yeah, but it's a very important question, for sure.
The next question is from one of our creative writing students. And she says, I'd like to know how Anja balances or switches between writing poetry and prose. I find it very difficult and would like her advice.
Yeah, I think it is difficult. And for me, I found out that I have times when I do write poetry, and I have times when I write prose. It absorbs everything else. It takes all the energy. I wouldn't sit at my desk and write all night, and in the morning go and write a poem. I think it's not that I don't write poetry when I write prose, but for me it's like a different, how to say, sometimes when I write prose, there's not much left really for writing poetry. Also probably because I write prose as I do, so I rather try to deal with language and with the way as I would in prose. I don't know. I think there's no easy solution, but for me, it always takes a little. It's like a boat which goes into this direction or in this direction. Sometimes it takes a little while to go back to the other. Wie würde man sagen?
Mode?
Yeah.
What is a mode? I don't know.
Ja, ich weiß auch nicht so genau. Yeah.
The next question we touched on a bit, but maybe you could respond a little bit more to it. It's about where all of the story was set. Like, how can you describe the trajectory of places that the novel goes through?
Through from A to Z, from beginning to end.
That's what the question is.
Yeah, it starts on the oil rig. It's an old shabby oil rig in front of the Morocco coast, and that's the stations of the journey briefly are Tangier, Morocco. Then he goes to Budapest, the capital, from there to the countryside where he meets the sister of Matthias, back to Budapest, and he's a guy who still thinks that he will just continue to work, so he will go back to Morocco. Then we are at the scene, in the scene which we just heard, where he sort of decides that he will not go back. He will be in the desert. He will be in Malta. He will be in where he also has a friend or a fiance, or no, not fiance, whatever. And from there, it goes closer to Europe. It's from Malta. He goes to southern Italy and up north. Then there's a lot of walking and a lot of then another another man he meets who was very important to him when he was a kid, and the way or the story goes north over the Alps to Germany and further north. Did I miss anything?
Then there's all of the places that it flashes back to. And there's Mexico, London, other places.
A jungle. There's a jungle as well. Yeah, Mexico is for sure important, and a lot of Polish memories as well, and a lot of memories from Václav's childhood in the narrow miners wing of Western Germany. Yeah, so that's also a part of German history after the war, when it was the miners were very important, and they were very proud of this community and of the coal miners. And that's the time when also Václav's father came there, and in the story Václav goes back there to see that everything is sort of closed, and the miners are they pump water into the coal mines. So yeah. Long answer, sorry.
No, that was great. We have 2 more questions, one for each of you. And someone is asking, what inspired you to want to translate novels?
Ooh, all novels at all. Well, that's The first question is what inspired me to want to translate, and then the second is because actually I did not start translating novels. I started translating poetry. And the answer to that question is it was a godsend, because I studied German in college and I had no idea what I was going to do with it. And I liked language, and I have been a musician, but none of those things really seem to add up to anything, especially, writing. I love language, but I don't really feel like I have a lot of stories to tell. And then I started reading this German poetry and I thought, wow, this is the greatest thing ever. Oh no, none of my friends can read it. Oh, look, I can write it again and it can be mine. I can write it over again. So that's sort of how I came to translation. And then fiction really was quite a different thing. I think sometimes there's a preconception that poetry is the hardest thing to translate and everything else can't be all that complicated. And at least when I started translating fiction, I found it in some ways much more difficult, in that the expectations for it are higher in terms, or the expectations for it are that you understand it, basically, or that at the end of the day, it's a sentence that you know, it might be poetic, but it should sound good and we should understand, and it should sound like people talking the way they really talk. And that's actually a very different skill and very challenging. I came from translating poetry where I thought, wow, I think it sounds good, it's new, it's fresh, cool. And it wasn't held to the same standard of, well, does that sound weird in English? And learning how to really exploit the English language in fiction was a different thing to learn, I think.
So
and musicality is also something you can really, I think, find in her translation.
Thank you.
So the last question is for you, Anja. And they ask, are the characters based on people you've met, their traits, physical descriptions, or did you come up with all of that on your own?
Well, I guess they are all mixtures. Sometimes people came up to me after reading saying like, so who's the real Václav? How is he? Which was really nice. But there is no, there's no man out there like him, probably. maybe. At least I wouldn't know him. I think it's a bit difficult to answer the question because for me, I'm a lot of the times I'm curious myself to get to know the other characters and to see who he has to deal with and how they interact. And so there's a lot of writing sort of off the, which never ends up in the book, but which just has dialogues and yeah, and I try to really get to know them myself. So I have an idea maybe who they are or what they are doing, but then you end up writing dialogues and you go like, oh, this can't be, this doesn't feel right. This is just how I would imagine someone saying something, and it's not good. So how they sort of come into the book is sort of a long story, I guess, and what we would find in here is just the small part which sort of gives you the image I was looking for. But looking for it was also a journey, I guess, for some of them.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Anja. Thank you, Anne. If it was a different time, we would be in person, and then now we could have the book sale and signing. But you can find this everywhere that you buy books, because it is just a gorgeous, wonderful book. And so please look for it. And thank you all again, and good luck with the National Book Award. We're rooting for you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having us. And
thank you very much for coming.
And thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you everyone.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.